The aluminum skin gleamed dull silver under the pale English dawn, streaked with oil and patched in a dozen places before it had even seen combat. Lieutenant James J. Farrell stood beneath the nose of the Martin B-26 Marauder, one hand resting against the cold fuselage, and felt the weight of all the stories he'd heard settle into his chest like a stone. They called them widowmakers, flying coffins. The Marauder had killed more men in training accidents than some aircraft lost in combat, its short wings and unforgiving aerodynamics demanding perfection from pilots who were still learning to master the sky. The takeoff speed was brutally high, the landing approach faster than anything most pilots had ever attempted, and if you lost an engine on ascent, the aircraft didn't glide. It fell, spinning like a brick with wings, carrying 6 men down to Earth with the inevitability of gravity itself. Farrell had named her Flak Bait after his family's terrier back in Greenwich, Connecticut. A scrappy little dog they'd nicknamed Flea Bait for its habit of attracting every pest in the neighborhood. The name felt right somehow, darkly prophetic in a way that made him smile even as his stomach twisted with fear. If any aircraft was going to attract the attention of every German gun between here and Berlin, it would be his. The nose art was simple, almost childlike. A cartoon dog with a mischievous grin, ears flying back in the slipstream. The ground crew chief, a wiry sergeant from Pittsburgh with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, had looked at the freshly painted letters and shaken his head. "You're tempting fate, Lieutenant," he'd said. Farrell had shrugged. Fate, he figured, didn't need much tempting in the skies over occupied Europe. The first mission was supposed to be a milk run, or as close to one as existed in the spring of 1943. A rail yard in northern France, moderate defenses, straightforward navigation. Farrell climbed into the cockpit with his co-pilot, a lanky Texan named Robert Sheets whose hands trembled slightly as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. Behind them, the bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners settled into their positions, each man alone with his thoughts in the cramped metal tube that would carry them into the teeth of the Reich's defenses. The engines coughed to life with a roar that vibrated through the airframe. Twin Pratt & Whitney are 2800s that together produced enough power to hurl the 20-ton bomber down the runway and claw it into the sky, if everything went perfectly. Farrell advanced the throttles with the kind of delicate precision a surgeon might use, feeling the Marauder strain against its brakes like a living thing desperate to run. The runway stretched ahead, a ribbon of concrete that seemed suddenly impossibly short. At his signal, they released, and acceleration slammed them back into their seats. The Marauder ate up the runway in seconds, the needle climbing toward the critical speed, and Farrell knew with absolute certainty that they were going to die. They were too heavy, too fast, the end of the runway rushing toward them and the aircraft still earthbound. Beside him, Sheets had gone pale, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. Farrell pulled back on the yoke with everything he had, feeling the nose want to lift but the main still rolling, and then contact broke. The wheels left the earth with barely 100 feet of runway remaining, and they were airborne, clawing for altitude as the Kentish countryside dropped away beneath them and Farrell's heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. They climbed into formation, 24 Marauders in tight box configuration, each aircraft so close you could see the rivets on your neighbor's wings. The channel crossing was choppy with spring turbulence, and then they were over France, and the pastoral landscape below transformed into something hostile and alien. Farrell could see the rail yard ahead, a tangle of steel and smoke, and then the first black puffs appeared in the air around them, German 88mm flak batteries opening up with methodical precision. The bursts came in clusters, each explosion a fist of shrapnel expanding outward at supersonic speed, and Flak Bait shuddered as fragments peppered her skin with a sound like hail on a tin roof. The bombardier called out the approach, and Farrell steadied the aircraft, flying straight and level because the Norden bombsight demanded it, those final 30 seconds of exposure where evasive action was impossible and every gun on the ground knew exactly where you'd be. Something hit them hard, a metallic bang that echoed through the fuselage, and the aircraft lurched sideways. Red lights flashed on the instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, number 2 engine temperature climbing. Sheets was shouting something, and behind them someone was screaming, but the bombardier's voice cut through. "Bombs away!" The aircraft leaped upward, suddenly lighter, and Farrell threw them into a diving turn, breaking formation, chasing speed and distance from that killing zone. The engine temperature gauge hit the red line and kept climbing. They nursed Flak Bait home on one engine and prayers, the aircraft vibrating like it was trying to shake itself apart. And when the wheels finally touched down at their base in Essex, Farrell sat in the cockpit for 5 minutes, hands still locked on the yoke, unable to make his fingers release. The ground crew counted 47 holes in the fuselage. 47 hits on the first mission. The crew chief shook his head again, but this time he was smiling. "She's a tough old bird," he said, running his hand along a ragged tear in the aluminum skin. "She'll keep bringing you home." And she did. Mission after mission, Flak Bait absorbed punishment that should have torn her from the sky. They flew through flak barges so dense the sky turned black with explosions, each burst a probability calculation written in fire and steel, and somehow the numbers kept falling in their favor. They took hits that severed control cables, punctured fuel tanks, shattered the plexiglass nose, and still the engines ran. Still the wings held. Still Farrell found a way to bring her back. There was a mission over Belgium where they lost the entire hydraulic system and had to lower the landing gear manually, cranking the wheels down with the emergency hand pump while the aircraft bucked and shuddered. And when they finally touched down, the tires were so shot full of holes they disintegrated on contact, and Flak Bait skidded down the runway on her rims, throwing sparks like a comet. There was a raid deep into Germany where a Messerschmitt Bf 109 made a head-on pass, cannon shells walking up the fuselage from tail to nose, and Farrell felt the round's impact like hammer blows, heard the navigator scream, and looked back to see daylight pouring through holes the size of dinner plates. But the navigator was alive, bleeding from a shallow scalp wound, alive and cursing, and Flak Bait kept flying. The crew developed a superstitious reverence for the aircraft, a belief that transcended rational thought. She was more than metal and rivets. She was their guardian, their salvation, a machine imbued with something approaching sentience by the sheer weight of their need to survive. Farrell began to dream about her. In his sleep, he was always in the cockpit, flying through an endless sky filled with black flowers of flak, and Flak Bait was speaking to him in a language he almost understood, telling him where to turn, when to dive, how to thread the needle between death and survival. He would wake in the barracks, heart racing, and know with absolute certainty which missions would be bad and which might be survivable. The other pilots thought he was crazy. His own crew thought he was lucky. Farrell didn't know what he believed anymore, except that the aluminum skin beneath his hands felt warm even in the frozen air at 12,000 feet, and sometimes when the flak was heaviest and the odds most impossible. He could swear he felt the aircraft responding not to his control inputs but to his thoughts, his fears, his desperate will to live. By the winter of 1943, they were veterans. Flak Bait had completed 50 missions, then 75, then 100, numbers that defied every statistical model the Army Air Force had developed. The standard tour was 25 missions, the point at which the odds said you'd be dead or broken. Most aircraft didn't survive 15. Flak Bait was approaching double digits in crew rotations. Men finished their tours and went home, and new faces climbed into the worn seats, and still the aircraft endured. The patches on her skin multiplied until there was more repair work than original aluminum. A patchwork quilt of battle damage lovingly mended by ground crews who worked through the night to keep her flying. Then came the spring of 1944, and the word that whispered through every airbase in England like wind through tall grass. Invasion. The missions intensified, targeting transportation networks, coastal defenses, ammunition dumps, anything that might slow the German response when the inevitable came. Farrell could feel the weight of history pressing down, the sense that everything they'd done, every mission survived, every hole patched, was prologue to something enormous and terrible. June 5, 1944. The briefing room was packed, every pilot and crew member in the 449th Bombardment Squadron crowded shoulder to shoulder, and when the curtain pulled back from the mission map, revealing the Normandy coast marked with dozens of red circles, the room went silent. D-Day. 0 hour. The invasion that would determine whether Europe lived under Nazi boots for a generation or whether freedom might yet be reclaimed. Their target was a German strongpoint overlooking Omaha Beach, concrete bunkers and artillery positions that would turn the landing zones into a slaughterhouse unless they could be neutralized before the first boats hit the sand. They launched in darkness, engines warming under the stars, and climbed into a sky crowded with aircraft. hundreds of bombers and fighters converging on the French coast from every airfield in southern England. Flak Bait slipped into formation, and Farrell could see the channel below, black water churning with the wakes of thousands of ships, an armada beyond comprehension. And he understood in that moment that this was not just another mission. This was the hinge of fate itself, and they were balanced on the edge. The German defenses were awake and furious. Flak filled the sky like a thunderstorm, shells bursting in patterns so dense they seemed solid, and fighters dove through the formation, guns blazing, and the radio was chaos, voices screaming, aircraft falling, parachutes blossoming white against the gray dawn. Flak Bait shuddered as shells exploded close enough to rock her sideways, fragments tearing through the fuselage, and Farrell heard metal shrieking, heard the tail gunner shouting that they'd lost half the rudder, but the target was ahead, the bunkers visible through the plexiglass, and the bombardier was counting down, steady as a metronome, and when the bombs fell away, Farrell saw them tumble down toward the concrete emplacements and prayed they'd hit true, prayed that the men on the beaches would have one less nightmare to face when they stormed ashore in 2 hours. They turned for home through a sky on fire. Number 2 engine was trailing smoke, cylinder head temperature climbing, and Farrell knew they'd have to shut it down soon or risk fire. He feathered the prop, adjusted for the asymmetric thrust, and nursed Flak Bait back across the channel on one engine, while fighters prowled the edges of the formation looking for stragglers. They landed with the last of their fuel, the gauge reading empty, and taxied to their hardstand where the ground crew was already waiting, tools in hand, ready to patch her up because they'd fly again today. 2 more missions before midnight, 2 more trips across that killing ground, and Flak Bait would endure both, absorbing hits that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, carrying her crew home through sheer stubborn refusal to die. 3 missions in less than 24 hours. Farrell sat in the barracks after the 3rd flight, hands shaking too hard to light a cigarette, and tried to comprehend that they were still alive. Every other aircraft in their squadron had taken casualties. 2 had gone down. But Flak Bait had brought them through, and when Farrell finally stumbled out to the hardstand to look at her, he counted 83 new holes in her skin, some small as pencils, others large enough to crawl through, and the ground crew chief just looked at him and said, "She's angry now." The summer and fall of 1944 were a blur of missions, the Allied advance grinding through France, each mile purchased with blood and bombs. Flak Bait flew support missions for Patton's Third Army, struck at German positions during the breakout from Normandy, hammered the Siegfried Line as winter approached. The missions blurred together into a continuous nightmare of flak and fear, but the crew had stopped expecting to die. They'd passed beyond superstition into something stranger, a fatalistic confidence that Flak Bait would protect them, that the aircraft had developed some inexplicable immunity to the laws of probability and physics that governed ordinary machines. December brought bitter cold and the shock of the German offensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge caught everyone by surprise, a massive counterattack that tore through American lines and threatened to split the Allied front in 2. Weather grounded most aircraft for days, fog and snow making flight impossible, and the ground forces bled under German assault with no air support. When the skies finally cleared, the call went out for every available bomber, and Flak Bait answered. The mission briefing was grim. German armor was concentrated in the forests south of Bastogne, and they needed to be stopped. The flak would be murderous, the Germans defending their last great gamble with everything they had. Farrell looked at his crew. Some faces were new, fresh replacements for men who'd completed their tours, but others had been with him since the beginning, eyes hollow with exhaustion, hands steady with experience, and told them the truth. This would be the worst mission yet. They flew through weather that should have killed them. Clouds so thick they flew on instruments, trusting the navigator's calculations and the aircraft's steadiness when they couldn't see their own wingtips. When they dropped below the overcast, the forests of the Ardennes spread beneath them, snow-covered and beautiful, and then the flak opened up and beauty became irrelevant. The Germans had concentrated their anti-aircraft batteries like never before, learning from years of aerial assault, and the sky became a solid wall of explosions. Flak Bait flew into it like a ship sailing into a hurricane. The first hit knocked out the intercom. The second hit, a shell that detonated close enough to lift the aircraft sideways, tore through the bomb bay, severing hydraulic lines and shredding the wiring harness. Warning lights cascaded across the panel, red and amber, every system screaming failure, and Farrell fought the controls as the aircraft tried to roll inverted. They couldn't abort, not with the ground forces dying below, so he steadied the bomber with brute force, arms burning with effort, and held her straight for the bombing run. The bombardier released manually when the electrical system failed, pulling the emergency lever, and the bombs tumbled away toward the German positions below. Flak Bait lurched upward, lighter, and Farrell threw her into a dive, chasing speed, chasing survival. Something was wrong with number 1 engine now, power fluctuating, and then it seized with a bang that shook the entire airframe, prop windmilling uselessly. They were flying home on 1 engine again, the aircraft barely maintaining altitude, descending in a slow spiral toward the frozen earth. The navigator plotted a course to the nearest friendly airfield, an emergency strip just behind the lines, and Farrell aimed for it with the single-minded focus of a drowning man swimming for shore. The engine temperature was climbing again, the oil pressure dropping, and he knew they had minutes before it failed completely. The runway appeared ahead, a scar of churned mud and snow, and Farrell brought Flak Bait in without hydraulics, without flaps, without any of the systems that made landing a 20-ton bomber something other than a controlled crash. They hit hard, the landing gear barely holding, and slid sideways through the mud before grinding to a halt 50 feet from a line of parked jeeps. Farrell climbed out of the cockpit and stood in the snow beside the fuselage, legs shaking, and looked at the damage. The entire left side of the aircraft was shredded. Metal peeled back in ragged sheets, daylight visible through a dozen holes large enough to fit his head through. The tail section was barely attached, held on by a few structural members and what looked like pure stubbornness. The right engine was blackened with oil and scorching, one step away from catastrophic failure. Any sane assessment would have written the aircraft off as scrap, damaged beyond repair, good only for parts. But the ground crew that arrived with the recovery trucks took one look and started planning the repairs. They'd heard of Flak Bait, the legendary marauder that refused to die, and they worked through the night in sub-zero temperatures, patching, welding, replacing, their breath fogging in the frigid air while they coaxed the aircraft back from the edge of destruction. 3 days later, Flak Bait flew back to Essex under her own power, engines rough but running, and returned to the mission roster like a fighter stepping back into the ring for another round. By the spring of 1945, as the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, Flak Bait had flown 200 missions. 200 sorties into combat, a number so far beyond the statistical survival range that it had ceased to have meaning. The aircraft was more patched than original metal now, a flying testament to the skill of ground crews and the inexplicable luck that had kept her aloft. The crew chief had stopped counting holes after they passed 1,000. The fuselage so riddled with patch damage that it looked like riveted lace. Each repair a scar earned in the brutal algebra of aerial combat. Farrell had been rotated home and back twice, finishing his tour and volunteering to return, unable to imagine not being Flak Bait's pilot. The connection between man and machine had grown so deep that he could feel when something was wrong before the instruments showed it, could sense damage before the crew reported it. Other pilots thought him touched by madness, but his crew knew better. They'd seen what the aircraft endured, how she brought them home when by every law of physics and probability they should have died, and they understood that something beyond the rational was at work. Mission 207 came in April 1945, a rail yard in southern Germany, the kind of routine target they'd hit 100 times before. The flak was moderate, the German defenses worn down by years of attrition, and they placed their bombs and turned for home through scattered clouds. Farrell flew relaxed, one hand on the yoke, watching the English countryside emerge from the haze ahead, and felt an overwhelming sense of completion settle over him like a benediction. This was the end. He knew it with the same certainty he'd known which missions would be bad, which battles they'd survive. The war was ending, and Flak Bait had carried them through to see it. They landed in perfect weather, the Marauder touching down smooth as silk, and taxied to the hardstand where the entire ground crew had gathered. When Farrell shut down the engines for the final time, the sudden silence felt profound, weighted with the memory of every mission, every near death, every impossible return. He climbed down from the cockpit and stood beside the fuselage, one hand resting on the patched aluminum, and felt the metal still warm from flight beneath his palm. The crew chief approached, eyes bright with emotion, and said simply, "Well done." The war ended 3 weeks later. Germany surrendered, and across Europe the guns fell silent. The great bomber fleets that had turned the skies black with their formations began to stand down, aircraft returning to the States or being stripped for parts, the machinery of total war dismantled in the exhausted peace. Most combat aircraft were scrapped, melted down, returned to the raw materials from which they'd been forged, their service complete and their value reduced to tonnage of aluminum. But not Flak Bait. Someone, and history has never recorded exactly who made the decision, recognized that this aircraft was different, that her survival was itself a story worth preserving. Instead of the scrapyard, Flak Bait was carefully disassembled, each section labeled and documented, and shipped back to the United States for preservation. She had flown more combat missions than any other American bomber in the war, had survived more damage than seemed physically possible, and had never lost a crew member to enemy action. Only one man wounded in all those missions, in all those thousands of flak hits and fighter attacks. The years passed. Flak Bait moved from storage to restoration, from warehouse to museum, her fuselage carefully preserved with all its battle damage intact. The patches remained, hundreds of them, each one marking a moment when death had reached out and been denied. The nose art stayed, the cartoon dog with his mischievous grin, and the mission markers marched down the fuselage in neat rows, 207 small bombs painted in precise formation, a tally of survival that defied comprehension. Today, she rests in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, suspended in the cathedral-like space of the restoration hangar, her patched skin visible to anyone who takes the time to look. Visitors walk beneath her wings, tourists and school children and veterans with distant eyes, and they see the holes, the repairs, the evidence of 1,000 moments when survival was measured in inches and luck and something harder to define. The aircraft is silent now, her engines cold, her propellers still, but there is something in the way light falls across her fuselage that suggests she is not truly at rest, that some essential part of her remains poised for flight, waiting for a mission that will never come. Farrell visited once, in the 1970s, an old man by then, walking slowly beneath the aircraft he'd flown through hell and back. He stood for a long time, one hand raised as if to touch the fuselage but not quite reaching, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory and wonder. "She saved us," he said. "Every single time. She brought us home." He died a few years later, and his family scattered some of his ashes near the museum, wanting him to rest close to the machine that had meant more to him than words could adequately express. The story of Flak Bait is ultimately a story about the strange alchemy between humans and the machines they create, the way steel and aluminum and rivets can become something more than their component parts when subjected to extreme stress and extreme need. Every mission she flew helped shorten the war, every bomb she delivered contributed to the liberation of Europe, and every time she brought her crew home alive, she gave those men the chance to see tomorrow, to return to families, to live lives that would have been stolen by the flak and the fighters and the brutal mathematics of aerial combat. Multiply that survival by 207 missions, by 6 crew members per mission, by the indirect effects of successful attacks on enemy infrastructure, and the equation expands beyond calculation, thousands of lives touched, altered, saved by the refusal of one aircraft to die. She hangs now in the hushed light of the museum, a relic of the most destructive war in human history, and yet there is something almost peaceful in her presence, as if the violent years have been transmuted into wisdom, pain into purpose. The patched holes in her skin are testament not to destruction but to resilience, to the stubborn human insistence that even in the face of overwhelming odds, even when probability says survival is impossible, sometimes, rarely, miraculously, the unlikely becomes real, and what should fall instead continues to fly, carrying fragile human hopes through a sky made of fire and steel into something approaching grace.